Born in Baltimore, Maryland, Matthew Johnson holds an MA in Peace and Conflict Studies from Hacettepe University in Turkey and a BA in Journalism from the University of Maryland. Although a product of the public school system, he is passionate about non-traditional educational environments. He previously worked at a youth detention center where he introduced a popular peace studies class, along with teaching English, social studies, and GED prep. Most recently, he taught at a progressive private school in New Jersey. Aside from teaching, conflict resolution and restorative justice are his main interests. He has researched and practiced alternatives to punishment or legal action in the context of schools, the justice system, and social movements for 5 years, serving thousands of students, prisoners, organizations, and community members. He is trained in numerous practices, including mediation, nonviolent third-party intervention, transformative justice, community conferencing, dialogue circles, restorative circles, and crisis counseling for trauma victims. And with that, I will now pass everything over to Matt, and he will begin his presentation.
All right, thanks a lot, David. Very happy to be here with you all virtually. And it's a topic I don't get to talk about much, but very important topic in this age of civil resistance and protest. So the title is, Why Did Occupy Stumble? Key Lessons for Activists Today. So just a summary of what I'll be discussing is the Occupy movement and key challenges starting from about 2010 and to 2012, where things really died down for Occupy really before that, but we'll talk about it a little bit. Learning from Occupy, so this is 2015, 2016, focus on some campaigns that came after Occupy and applying some of the lessons there and what they did that was similar to Occupy, what they did that might have been different. And then really bringing it up to today, resistance in the age of Trump, this year and beyond. And then some general takeaways for organizers, whether, you know, there's resistance to Trump or some other type of movement, grassroots movement that involves civil resistance. So just a background to the Occupy movement. We have this slogan, the 99%. We are the 99%. It's a lot of cases, in many cases, this was attributed to a professor named David Graeber, who is London-based, London School of Economics, anthropologist. I highly recommend his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. It's a remarkable book. I didn't know anything about him until he was mentioned in connection with this protest that was planned by Adbusters, which is a cultural jamming, anti-consumerist magazine in Canada that called for protesters to occupy Wall Street on September 17, 2011. And this was, in a lot of ways, I mean, I had been paying attention to this, I'm sure many of you were as well, the Arab Spring and Tahrir Square. This was sort of, they said, make Wall Street in the Tahrir Square of the United States. And so that was where the call came from. And David Graeber was part of organizing what was known as the GAs, or the General Assemblies, which was a very anarchist, consensus-based way of organizing, which I'll get into a little bit later. And he's also been called the father of the Occupy movement in certain ways, and again credited with the "We Are the 99%." The reason why I have U.S. Uncut and the Tea Party on here, they're not directly part of Occupy, but U.S. Uncut came out of UK Uncut, and it was a movement, very decentralized movement, in a lot of ways like Occupy. I was very much involved in it actually in DC, and we targeted corporations that were not paying their taxes. And it was actually a lot more effective in the UK. It got major corporations in the UK to actually apologize and start paying more tax. In the US, it was mostly geared around Bank of America and their connection to the bailouts, and the fact that I think for 2 years after they received the government bailout, they did not pay their taxes. And referring to the bailouts that came in after the 2008 the recession. So that was a precursor to the Occupy movement. A lot of people argued U.S. Uncut. And the Tea Party is on here, certainly ideologically very much opposed to Occupy, but it was a lot of cases, if you remember the paper, called Occupy the sort of Tea Party of the left, or you know, this. They both occurred under the Obama administration. The Tea Party happened earlier, and it was more. It was they were similar in the sense that they started, at least the Tea Party became something different, but started as grassroots movements that were very much opposed to something rather than for something, and were very visible, got a lot of media attention, and and we'll probably come back to that topic as well. So a lot of this is going to be Occupy DC focused in a lot of ways. I did have the opportunity to travel to Occupy Wall Street, and as well as other encampments, Oakland, Baltimore, throughout the country. There were many, as people might remember. There's some more smaller than others. But I spent most of my time with Occupy DC, and there were two different encampments in Occupy DC, which actually made it unique. Otherwise, I think it was pretty much comparable to the other encampments, but there happened to be two, and that's a complicated story, which I'm going to get into a little bit. But the first call to action in DC was for October 11th, and the demonstration was in Freedom Plaza, and I still remember it. It was very, very, very good demonstration, very well attended. And one of the main leaders of that was a man named Kevin Zeese, longtime DC area-based activist and organizer. Now he runs the website popularresistance.org. And at the time, it was not really called Occupy, and that led to some controversy later. It was called Stop the Machine, and then it evolved into an Occupy encampment afterward, because people stuck around. They didn't just go home after the demonstration. Now, interestingly enough, right before that, early in the very early days of October 2011, there was another spontaneous, I don't really know all the origins of it, that came, but there was only maybe 4 activists that started out occupying Franklin Square, which was only within a short walk of Freedom Plaza in Northwest DC, if people are familiar. These were younger activists. They didn't seem to have as much experience, and there was no clear leader. And the GAs got started, I think, pretty much immediately. There was a few people camping, and then over time it grew, and at one point it was a lot bigger than the encampment at Freedom Plaza, from what I recall. So there was some controversy between these two camps, which I will return to, and they never unified, despite a lot of efforts, including my own efforts to change that. So, okay, so here's just a picture of some demonstrators downtown around the Smithsonian. All right, so I broke the first part of my presentation into 5 main challenges that particularly Occupy DC experienced. And so we have rugged individualism, and I'll explain these in more detail. Lack of respect for leadership, sectarianism, internal oppression, and lack of training and discipline. So the first, we had really a phenomenon of separate but equal ideologies, as I would call it, whereas you could have someone who, and not to be pejorative, but activists who, just to show you the range, who were really making up some wild theories that didn't have a strong basis in reality, but were considered equal to someone who had been studying issues of wealth inequality for decades and were involved in politics for decades, that had a much more reasonable, much more research theory, and these were all sort of thrown into the same pot, and there was not really a lot of very careful consideration of what was true and what wasn't, and what we should organize around as a movement. And that led to lack of unity as well, lack of unity around messaging, around tactics, and a lot of spontaneity. So for example, if one group just wanted to have a march in the middle of a GA when we were planning for something in the future, that would just happen, and there wasn't a whole lot of norms around stopping that, or and that goes into discipline as well. And I would just say, people could be pretty self-important and thought their ideas were better than others, and would go to a lot of trouble to take the mic, even though there were certain supposed to be norms around sharing the space. And so there was a lot of contradiction in this rugged individualism. So it's just another photo. just interspersed a couple photos that some of them relate directly to these items, these 5 items. So 2, lack of respect for leadership. One thing I kept hearing from Kevin Zeese was the first I heard it from was, we're not a leaderless movement, we're a leaderful movement. And it really, it was something that I never really got my head around fully while I was there, because I didn't feel that, I guess I take a more broad definition of leadership where it includes sometimes following and sometimes really falling into line, because either you don't have a better idea, or because sometimes unity might be more important than always expressing your slight opposition. If you can go along with most of it, maybe, you know, just follow in line so things can get done. And there was a lot of sort of, I would say, discomfort with following within the movement, and or with identifying someone as the leader, or if anybody sort of emerged as the leader. Rarely did anybody declare themselves as a leader of anything, but if someone was emerging like Kevin Zeese, because he was an initial organizer or charismatic and vocal, and there was a lot of suspicion, and there was a lot of rejection of that type of leadership. And then the worst elements of it, and there's articles that I could still point to online, that one that I read just to prep for this, where people will, you know, throw out all kinds of accusations against these leaders that emerged around what their true intentions are, or cherry pick certain statements that they made or things they'd written to make it out like they have a separate agenda. And maybe in some cases they did have a separate agenda, but it would become very, very suspicious of leadership, even people who are mostly on the same side. And I just like this photo from one of the Occupy encampments. And it symbolizes some of this. So through sectarianism, there was a lot of different groups who maybe from an outsider perspective, they weren't all that different. They kind of got lumped together a lot of cases by the opposition or in the press, but you really did have real differences of opinion within Occupy, even within the people who camped out and lived next to each other. You know, you had people identifying themselves as anarchists, and then you had this sort of more, like you assume like the black bloc type, but then you had the more intellectual anarchists like David Graeber, and then you had a progressive bloc that really just wanted to reform the government and pass real laws to help people right now, and maybe incremental approach, not necessarily smash the system. Maybe they were pro-capitalist. And then you had apolitical. And the reason why I say apolitical is there were people in the camps that really, in my opinion, were not there to change the world in any real way. They were there because it was interesting. Maybe they already lived in the park. I mean, there were a number of people who frequenting these parks, especially in DC, prior to Occupy and this explosion of enthusiasm with Occupy. So then everybody was really there to change the world, and some of them maybe reluctantly were started to get involved in this because they just happened to be there. They were being fed by food not bombs, and they stuck around and, you know, attended some of the GA. But that was an interesting group of people that were involved. And then you had this. There was always this sort of conflict between people who commuted into the camp, and I admit I was one of them, and campers who camped out. And the campers who camped out felt that they were making more sacrifices, and this is a generalization, and the commuters, you know, might come in for certain things that they wanted and then leave right away, and so there was some disconnect between these two groups. And then you had what I call natives versus settlers, and this is particularly an issue in DC. I don't know if it applied so much to other camps, but you had a lot of folks come to DC to protest and then leave because they're not from DC, and they may stay for a few days and all. And then you had the DC natives who had been protesting for maybe in some cases decades, and a lot of times they had different goals. And maybe the natives were more concerned with the fact that protests maybe don't achieve as much. We need the long-term organizing. And the settlers, quote unquote, are those who helicopter into DC every once in a while. Maybe you're not concerned with the local community so much, and that was a perception that a lot of the natives had expressed. So there's another picture. Voting failed. Prepare for riots. So the next part, internal oppression, and what we saw here is a lot of, and I'm probably going to go through this a little quicker because I realize time is a little lacking. there was a lot of perceived or real, and I don't want to minimize by saying it was all, this is just a perception, of racism, sexism, disrespect for working people, poorer people, because there were middle-class people who were involved. I doubt there were too many rich people. And, these disconnects between these groups, these real acts of prejudice, and that, I mean, there were, I should say that I witnessed many problematic statements and even actions. I witnessed a sexual assault there. There were many real things that happened, but there were also a lot of perceptions that maybe if there was an example where a man of color was accused of sexual assault, and he actually had later admitted to doing it, but there was a perception that he was being singled out because he was a person of color, and people rallied around him. And even though he had himself admitted to, or basically admitted to doing something he should not have done, and then there were people that were calling him names that were not reflective of what he actually did or who he actually was, and just scapegoating him. And the potential for violence was real in certain cases, especially as the winter dragged on. And so, and there were a number of small caucuses as a result of this, and then there was opposition to those caucuses on the grounds of, this is identity politics, quote unquote, and things like that. So there were a lot of divisions that came from real or perceived oppression based on a person's individual identity, and in some cases based on what their real motives were. But that was much more lesser, and also to the extent that they were believed in consensus process versus more traditional decision making. Just another photo. So last but not least, lack of training and discipline. So we had activists who were coming in that for the first time hadn't had a lot of training experience. Then there was, again, folks that were not really activists, that were in the park for one reason or another, and are walking by but decided to get involved in some way. There were mental health and behavioral challenges. There were individuals that just refused to follow even the norms that everybody had agreed upon. And I mean, this is really a fact. This is not a pejorative. There were folks who had been there from the beginning, who had helped set rules around the GA and decide in general assemblies and other things, and just one day maybe were upset and about something and really wanted to monopolize the conversation. Even people threatening others joining the GAs. I witnessed this numerous times, or speaking in ways that were unproductive, in my opinion, and did not further the agenda. And then there were folks who really needed, in my opinion, needed services that they could not get at the park or were not getting from our healthcare system. And there were a lot of numerous challenges around that, and what they might then do that could hurt the movement in some way, internally and externally. And then I mentioned lack of adherence to rules and norms. And here's just kind of an example of maybe some of that. So just quickly, since Occupy, obviously there have been a number of campaigns, and there have been a number of successes and failures for progressive movements, left movements. Just to really quickly go through a few, and I'm not doing them justice, and I really won't even get to really touch much on Black Lives Matter. I did want to mention it briefly because I would say one major difference is that Black Lives Matter is a lot more exclusive than Occupy, in the sense that they, make sure they're led by folks of color, Black folks, and there's prescribed roles for more so for whites, and whereas Occupy did not have that. That's a major difference, and much more focused on their cause around police brutality and things to help the Black community specifically. Democracy Spring, Democracy Awakening what is a movement that really began in the last year and a half, very recent, very related in a lot of ways to at least Occupy's implicit goals, but they make them a lot more explicit around changing the political system to get corporate money out of politics, to protect voting rights, although very different in the sense that Occupy wasn't involved so much in even talking about voting. A lot of people thought voting was not part of Occupy, seen almost as reactionary, whereas Democracy Spring pretty much mandates that one of its principles is vote. Also obviously use civil disobedience in order to, civil resistance, to change the country, change the laws, but also vote. And the other thing about Democracy Spring that is much more, in a sense, that sort of brings more discipline to the political forefront and the resistance campaign is that they are explicitly nonviolent and nonviolent in their principles, and make that very clear on their website. Whereas Occupy had a lot of difficulties around that, and a lot of arguments. I remember Oakland campment actually refused to declare itself nonviolent during the Occupy movement. And then, of course, Standing Rock, also a lot more focused. Actually, let me, move on and show you the Democracy Spring slide real quick. Even though I just mentioned that. Apologies. Standing Rock, again, more focused on particular goals: block the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota, protect indigenous water rights. There were certainly, I was not, I should say this, if, I apologize in advance, but I was not very involved with Standing Rock, other than maybe being on a conference call or two and talking to people who had been to North Dakota, but I'd never been to North Dakota. But I did hear reports that there was a lot of division between those who were more intimately involved and from North Dakota had been more involved in the protest directly, which started last year. If people aren't familiar, in July, around blocking the Dakota Access Pipeline going through indigenous lands. And I mean, there was divisions between those from those lands and those who were helicoptering in, to go back to the DC issue, to help out as allies, etc. And the other aspect is that this, Occupy was, the reason why I say different kind of occupation, came under some fire from the indigenous communities around using the term Occupy. And this was still an occupation, but it was really much an occupation of people's lands, that, people who were from those lands, keeping, maintaining that territory for their own rights and self-determination. And in some ways it was very different from Occupy, which was really more about occupying public spaces that maybe belonged to them in a more loose way. And so there's a kind of interesting connection there, I felt. And one similarity, though, is that Standing Rock did have a boycott element, boycotting of banks, which the Occupy movement also included. That continues. So moving forward to the current political situation and the anti-Trump protests, we had the anti-inaugural and the Women's March, the anti-inaugural protests and the Women's March. And I only lumped them two together because of the timing, that the Women's March was right after the Trump inauguration. And one thing specifically about the Women's March in particular, and I was just reading, there's a series in the Washington Post that's actually they've made the claim that it could be the next big movement in the United States, the next big resistance movement, and could be a lot more effective than Occupy and other movements since. And one of the reasons that it cites is that it's very, at least in the early manifestations of it, certainly if anybody like myself was there was over 3 million people that participated just in the United States that Saturday after the very difficult day for all of us when Trump was inaugurated. Even the opponents of the Women's March admitted that it was very nonviolent. It was largely nonviolent, and I should say almost entirely nonviolent in its manifestation, and disciplined. And so the Washington Post says, that could be a reason why it could succeed. But moreover, maybe even more important, it appeals to such a wide cross-selection of citizenry, even wealthier folks that maybe they argue were not so interested in Occupy. And also then it's harder for them to be dismissed in the press or the police to crack down on them, because you are dealing with a wealthier cross-section of society. And if people are familiar with Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan's research on why civil resistance movements work, those are two elements that are important, that this nonviolent discipline, as well as getting a large sector of involvement from society and reducing barriers to access, things like that. So the Women's March certainly has the early, had a lot of those elements. And then I just mentioned briefly because of their effectiveness in the short term, the airport protests after Trump's Muslim ban, and how spontaneous they seem to be around, similar, reminded me of Occupy, just spreading up everywhere. I didn't even know about it, and then all of a sudden there's all these people at Dulles, and also maintaining nonviolent discipline. Indivisible is actually directly related to the Tea Party, and so just take it full circle. If people are familiar, this is a guide that has been sent around telling opponents of Trump, and not only progressive ones, but really anybody who's opposed to Trump's agenda, particularly around healthcare. So this was somewhat dated in the sense before the failure of the Republicans around healthcare, repealing the Affordable Care Act. This was a guide to how to approach particularly Republican members of Congress in their own districts around town hall meetings to block the Trump agenda, to push them away from furthering Trump's agenda, and not to have any positive solutions or anything, but just to block the Trump agenda. And it was completely based around the tactics the Tea Party used, but instead of going after the Obama administration, to go after the Trump administration and his Republican enablers. And so that's why I mentioned that as an example of how things are shifting and are still the same in some ways. And then also I mentioned Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders, maybe more than any other politician who's still popular right now, just is a sort of clean line from Occupy to Bernie Sanders, in the sense that they use a lot of the same rhetoric. Bernie Sanders talks a lot about the 99%. And he talks, or I think he's probably used that as well, that exact terminology, but he certainly talked a lot about the wealth gap. He's talked a lot about Wall Street and the bankers and corporate governance and many of these things. And he's extremely popular to this day, despite losing in the Democratic primary, of course. And so I thought I'd be remiss without mentioning him, even though there's no direct connection to civil disobedience. But a lot of the politics and rhetoric are similar and echo the Occupy movement. So moving forward, this will be toward the end, and then we'll get to, I'm sure, I hope are a lot of questions and comments. What movements, progressive movements, or well, really any movement should think about moving forward from these lessons is how they're going to navigate goals and demands. Occupy, as everyone knows, the main criticism in the beginning was, where is your clear goal? The sort of canard is, should only have one goal. Occupy never completely got its head around any, there was some documents that were produced, but at least the perception was that by many is that it didn't have goals. And some people thought that was a good idea. A lot of people didn't. And so I think any movement needs to think about its goals and demands moving forward. Strategy and tactics, it goes back to nonviolence. To what extent are you going to, the nonviolent, the research around nonviolent civil resistance seems to indicate that you can't really have it both ways. You're either nonviolent or you aren't. You're either very disciplined, very nonviolent, and you'll be perceived that way, or you're not, and you will be perceived as violent. So there's a lot of difficulty of trying to have it both ways there, and a lot of movements struggle with that, particularly Occupy. And then media and reputation. I don't know if I mentioned, but there was a lot of statements that were made to the media by the Occupy movement that were not even necessarily in line with why people set out to protest and Occupy to begin with. It was a lot, it goes back to the leaderless and leaderful. There was not, some efforts to capture the media in a positive way were successful, others were not. If you remember the Women's March, there was the Madonna statement that the media focused in on about that advocated violence or seemingly advocated violence. I don't even remember the specific statement. And so every movement needs to think about how they're going to control the media and control who is in the limelight, who's making speeches, what they're going to say to the press. And then allies and opponents. And this is an interesting one I didn't discuss as much. And it's not always clear with movements who they're targeting to make a change. Occupy, it was confusing, especially in DC. Are we targeting the government? Are we targeting Wall Street? Are we targeting specific banks? Some cases there was actions where it was very clear who we were targeting. Other actions it wasn't. I mentioned U.S. Uncut. The target was very clear in U.S. Uncut. We had a specific target, and that's what we focused on. Even with the Women's March, and I mean, obviously, in the age of resistance to Trump, Trump is the target, but Women's March, obviously, there are more targets than just Trump. There's more local actions that are being conducted, and more long-term campaigns that will go beyond Trump. So that's always things to think about. And also who our allies are, who we want to bring into the fold that are not yet there. And then obviously leaders and followers. And are we going to consider ourselves all leaders in a movement? Are we going to have a clear chain of command? And are we going to sort of bring back this tradition of following that I personally think is important, that seems to have fallen out of it's like everyone wants to be a leader now. No one wants to be a disciplined soldier anymore, you know, even a nonviolent one. So just my 2 cents on that. So here are just a few resources before we move into questions. The second 2 are articles I've written. The first, Occupy Justice, being about calling for it's old and dated, but calling for some type of restorative process to help the Occupy camps deal with their own internal conflicts. And I think it's actually very relevant to any social movement, though, however, and just to have that sense that we need to talk about how we're going to deal with our own conflicts and our own disagreements, and not just, you know, shout down each other, accuse each other of being agents of the other side and things like that. And also some good analysis in the first 2 links, especially the second around what Occupy Wall Street did achieve, which I haven't really had a chance to focus on at all. And then the last link that I provided is really just reiterating the 5 areas of critique and why Occupy stumbled that I already went into. And just to note, so the pictures are by David Shankbone from WikiCommons, and the text of the slides is by myself.
You can interact with us on Twitter as well, and send us your thoughts and reactions using the ICNC webinars hashtag. And I guess I'll jump right into the first question, Matthew, and that is, you know, as a participant in Occupy, looking back now, what would you have done differently?
Well, so wow, there's so many things I could talk about. I think I should say, and I forgot to say all this background, but when I first participated in Occupy, my role wasn't even clear to me, much less to everybody there, because I was actually unemployed at the time. So in a lot of ways, I identified very strongly with the a lot of the activists, but I was interning at an organization that did conflict resolution. So I was trying to apply some of the things I was learning to Occupy. So it was very much a laboratory to me, even though it was also geared, I did see it as tied into my ability to get a job and have some decent standard of living. So it wasn't just like a project, you know, where I could just go back to my real life. So I think that I would have had a clear idea of my relationship to the movement, a clear idea if I could go back, and also I would have maybe camped out, or maybe spent even more time trying to get some of these conflict resolution, restorative justice process ideas flowing through both the camps. And really the one thing I regret is not being able to unite the 2 camps. I really thought that was a potential. I mean, in the end, it actually happened anyway, because the numbers were dwindling so much that there just wasn't enough to maintain both of them. But I think it would have been great to have achieved some kind of breakthrough where, yes, we can resolve our differences, and because we're 95% on the same page, but there's this 5%, but that's not going to cripple us and keep us from, you know, figuring out who the real, targeting the real opponent to justice and equality in this country. And so I think the twofold, it's really just coming up with a clear role within the movement, and also doing more to bridge those very serious divisions that I pointed out. But thanks for the question.
All right, great. Somebody asks, can you speak to the importance of inclusion and accessibility in organizing nonviolent civil disobedience? Can you share any best practices for ensuring that the voices or needs of the most marginalized in society are centered?
So honestly, for me, this is the question that I would really like to ask everybody else, because I'm not sure. I mean, this just to be very humble about it, with what I mentioned about particularly mental health concerns we had in the camps. I mean, I'm not at all implying that those with those special needs or other needs, other accessibility needs, physical disabilities as well, should not be involved. It was just very much beyond what we were able to, I feel like we just didn't have the skills and the knowledge to make that happen. And I really am looking for an answer to that in myself. I would just say that these are conversations that we need to have more of. I think, this is obviously an extremely diverse country, and I think to achieve the goals we want to achieve, we have to involve everybody, especially those that are most affected. I think my short answer would be we really have to ask those most affected by the problems we're trying to address through protest or organizing. Ask them what they need to be more involved, and I think then we'll have a lot stronger of an answer than I can give.
Yeah, hi, John Rudy, Peacemaker in Residence at Elizabethtown College. I noted that Julia Bacha in her TED Talk was citing some research, I think by Chenoweth and Stephan, saying that when women head up any nonviolent movement, the chances of success of achieving those objectives are much, much higher. And I wonder your thoughts on women organizing and taking leadership, if that is part of this leadership, addressing the leadership questions you have.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I can only certainly hope that it will lead. I mean, me personally, as a progressive activist, hope that it will lead to more change in the context of this country. I think I didn't mention this, but the Occupy movement actually gained a lot of its inspiration indirectly. I don't think too many activists on the ground necessarily were aware of this, but there were articles written about it, that the suffragette movement, women's suffrage in the late 19th, early 20th century, they had a lot of these local organizing practices, consensus decision making that sort of was used then by the Occupy movement. And so there, even in that level, there's a lot that we could take from the women's movement moving forward. But as far as things being women-led movement, but as far as lowering the barriers to participation, obviously I just think seeing women involved and seeing women on the streets in numbers, just in general, I mean, makes me more likely to want to get involved. I don't know about others, but it kind of has a more of a feeling that it's safer, it's less violent, because usually women might then bring children, and so there's more of an atmosphere that people feel. A lot of people, this is something a lot of people take seriously, and it's not just a fringe movement. And obviously women are a large percentage of, if not the majority. So thanks for the question.
All right, it looks like I'll see if Maciej has his audio issue. Maciej, go ahead and unmute yourself so you can ask your question.
Great, David, you can hear me right now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Right, David.
Maciej, hello?
Push forward. Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, so I will come to my question. When I see the difference in terms of the environment within which civic groups are organizing those days and in 2010, there are probably two major differences that I see. One is polarization, and the second one is what I would call populism. And I would be interested, Matt, in your view about what are the challenges for organizing civil resistance movement in the age of fragmentation or polarization, where 80–90% of the Republican voters, in fact, support strongly policy and agenda put forward by Trump administration. Which indicates that there is kind of consolidation around his agenda among his supporters rather than those supporters leaving him. on one hand, and then of course polarization and radicalization on the left. So then, how to organize civil resistance in such a polarized and fragmented society? And the second thing is populism, which is in fact based on kind of grassroots mobilization and with the kind of populist leader in charge. And here, how to kind of organize also grassroots type of mobilization to counteract populism. So I would appreciate your reflections on those two issues.
Yeah, I don't know if I heard all the second part because it was a little unclear, but I think so the first part though that I definitely can comment on is something that I've been thinking a lot about. It seems to me, and this is somewhat of a controversial statement, but that, you know, I mean, when I was a younger activist, though, I would never have made a statement like this, and so things change generationally as well to some extent. But it feels like to me that on both sides of the political divide, there's just a real coming away from the values, the sort of shared values that we have around, you know, just to take the extreme answer, you know, example, not wanting to be ruled by, you know, by a foreign government like Russia, you know, whereas I feel like it's alarming to me how little both sides are, how you know, the lack of seriousness that both sides are taking that issue, even though we haven't had all the facts, certainly. And I think it's and you know, the animosity toward Hillary Clinton was another thing I had trouble understanding from both sides of the spectrum. Whereas, you know, you have a figure who's extremely dangerous to democracy to me, even if you know, liked his show, and then you have someone who, you know, you may be polarizing in a lot of ways. You may have differences of opinion with her, whether you're on the right or the left, but is still remarkably more qualified, and yet people are finding all of these reasons to just not only not vote for Hillary Clinton, but actually hate Hillary Clinton. And extending into this diehard, let's hold the line, you know, as Trump supporters, even Republican insiders who should, you know better, you know, even though he's very quickly unraveling in a lot of ways. So I mean, it's a tough issue. I would hope that there would be something to unify more sectors of the population, like we talked about with successful civil resistance movements, around these shared values that even if we're Republicans or Democrats or, you know, don't vote at all in most elections or anarchists or, you know, whatever, that we're going to recognize that you know, the country has real challenges that indirectly affect all of us, even people that are not vulnerable so much. And that, you know, we need to do the right thing for democracy and not simply, you know, carve out our little issue and stick to it, or you know, have partisan approaches to everything. And did I cover both sides of your parts of what you asked, Maciej?
My second question was about populism. So, you know, in fact, you know, organizing civil resistance in the age of populist leader that is in charge relies oftentimes on the same type of mobilization tactic to mobilize its own supporters to go out on the street.
Right. Well, I think that's a great question. I like, that's why I brought up Indivisible, this guide to organizing against Trump using Tea Party, populist Tea Party tactics in, you know, 2009, that area, 2009, 2010 or so under Obama. I mean, it's kind of hard to remember sometimes, but Obama was and is a very popular political figure, president, you know, former president. And the Republicans were able to mount, not even the Republicans, sorry, the grassroots right were able to mount a very significant challenge to him on a populist level that was really just around the lines of, you know, really it was, a lot of it was centered in fantasy about what the Affordable Care Act was going to do with death panels and things that really weren't founded in reality. And yet it was extremely effective. And I think that this idea of mobilizing around saying no to the Trump agenda from a more populist perspective, for more populist appeal, could be an effective strategy. I'm not sure. I mean, I have issues with it certainly, but it is certainly a challenge, because Trump, despite his very upper class roots and you know, a lot of other things that make him not a man of the people, you know, to some people that don't have a whole lot in common with him in any real way, see him as their savior, as their man, their guy, and their strong man in charge. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the effective response is. I mean, I personally think that the popularity that Bernie Sanders still enjoys is part of the solution. Thinking in those terms, that there are, you know, obviously politicians from the left can still have that same populist appeal, and we should keep that in mind as well.
All right, great, thank you. Another question that we have is, how can you handle groups that show up to antagonize and incite violence? Those people that kind of stir up emotions to purposely defeat the anti-violent intentions.
Yeah, so wow, no softball questions here. So as far as, though, I mean, I could go into so many stories where I think I'll give one example of what I liked, and it's certainly going to be controversial to some, but there were a number of individuals that I mentioned that I'd witnessed, not just in the Occupy movement, but in other circles, in other progressive circles, who I felt would have been more helpful to the movement if they were just not involved at all. And the reason was that, you know, regardless of their politics, and I wasn't one of the people that was necessarily saying that they were agent provocateurs, working for some other, you know, I don't know, whoever, but that their behavior was actually creating barriers to participation, that people would not come to the meetings. I mean, if one thing we mentioned women, if you looked at Occupy DC in particular, as the winter months wore on, and I mean, certainly the cold had a lot to do with it, a lot of women just disappeared from the camp. There was so many more men than women, where in the beginning it wasn't so much like that. And a lot of that really did have to do with some of these individuals who, in my mind, really shouldn't have been involved. And but to answer the question in a positive way, and I lost my train of thought around that. Oh yeah. So one positive thing I saw is that I saw a number of these angry, mostly male, you know, identified folks, you know, raising Cain, and maybe it was more about their personal issues than the actual politics, and threatening people that tried to stop them or tried to get them to sit down. If anybody even did get them to sit down, sometimes they were really just given, in my mind, a platform, sort of enable. So the first thing I would say is just don't enable these individuals. And one example where this did not occur was in where I think the right response was taken was in Occupy Oakland, and I had just gotten there, and it was in the middle of a GA, and there was a individual who walked toward the front of where the facilitators were during the GA, and he was clearly drunk. I mean, that's not being, you know, that he just clearly was. I mean, I talked to him afterward, and you know, and he just walked toward where basically disrupted the meeting and where he was standing, and then started talking about something that was completely off topic, and he wouldn't stop, and he wasn't respecting any of the norms or the you know, the stack that they call it, where you have to get in line to talk. And this is the only time I've ever seen this done, but it was very effective. A couple of the facilitators, or I think it was one of the facilitators and a couple of the people from the audience, just basically said, "You're not going to disrupt this meeting," and they said it loud so everybody could hear it. And they literally grabbed the guy and they pulled, I mean, not roughly, I actually kind of went closer to make sure that nobody was going to get hurt, but they, or, you know, to hopefully intervene if I had to with some, you know, crisis intervention type, you know, skill training that I had done. But they basically escorted this man gently away from the meeting, and to me, I think sometimes that's what you have to do. I mean, and that's, you know, I know that's controversial, but or other cases, you have to find ways to distance yourselves from, as a movement, from individuals who are causing you bad publicity or saying things that are, you know, not, you know, either prejudicial or in some ways against the movement.
All right, great, thank you. Somebody else asks, how do we go about building community and finding common ground with opponents who are not relying on facts, science, or reality to form their opinions?
Well, yeah, I struggled with that recently, well, it wasn't that recently, but Thanksgiving it comes to mind as the first thing I thought of, Thanksgiving dinner for me. But I think again, it kind of goes back to shared values. I mean, and this is really like around a skill around to negotiation and just basic conflict resolution. You'll find this in like the Harvard Negotiation Project books, if people are familiar, Bill Urey and folks like that, which is that behind every position. So if I say global warming is not man-made, right? That's a position. There's a value or a interest behind that position, and a lot of times you have to get to that interest in order to understand where somebody's really coming from. So it might turn out that that position, though not founded in reality per se, there's a real interest that maybe I on the other side who thinks that we should do something immediately about climate change, maybe we can find some common interest. Maybe the interest behind denying man-made global warming could be have to do with fearing that there won't be, the economy will crash if we do anything, to produce, get away from fossil fuels, for example, that the economy will crash and, my children won't get to college. Sometimes we don't really know where the person on the other side is coming from. We're so fixated on what the positions we're taking. We don't really know what deep, not just interests that they have in the future or their children or themselves, their livelihoods. Maybe they think they'll lose their job because they work in fossil fuels. We sometimes, not only do we not think of that, we don't think of, what emotions that there are behind that. And it's because it's really icky. We don't want to have that emotional discussion, especially with somebody who's screaming at us, or I remember the taxi driver that rode by one of the Occupy protests I was at and said, "Get a job," and I mean, it's like, and I was going to say, well, why don't you? And then I realized he was driving the taxi, so I was like, well, what's your job? So he had one, but we sometimes, it's rare that we get to have that level of a discourse and find out, well, where are they coming from? Maybe this taxi driver felt that the real way to participate as citizens, I don't know, was to do your job loyally, and because maybe every time he spoke up, he got fired or bad things happened. And I mean, we really don't know where people are coming from. So just by their position, I should say, just by them saying something, like there's no man-made global warming, or Hillary's a crook, or we don't really know what's deeply below the surface. And so I think that my answer to that is to just really challenge yourself to have those deeper conversations and try to get to the core of what people are saying and how they're feeling. And actually, just a quick exercise that I read about recently that you could do is to try to argue to, like, then writing it is actually more effective, and they found that this really helped on a lot of levels, both introspectively and actually helping people shape their message to win over other people. So when you think about, for example, let's take climate change, for example, if you take that as an issue that you want to deal with, then think about how you would argue that to a conservative, not to one of your friends per se, that's maybe because all your friends are liberal or progressive, but think about how you would write an essay convincing a conservative to see that issue your way. And you would not use the same rhetoric, you would not use the same arguments. And so a lot of it is really stepping outside of your shoes and seeing something from another person's perspective in order to convince them.